Well, good afternoon. As you know, I'm standing in for Raymond Plant, who was the Regius Professor of Divinity here this year, but he had a heart attack. I'm glad to say that he's recovering from that, but still doesn't feel he can give these lectures. So here I am, a substitute. And this is the fourth of four. And in the lectures I've given, I've been talking about religion and experience, a philosophical explanation. And perhaps I have to explain that a little. What do I mean by a philosophical explanation? Well, I don't think theologians as such are necessarily committed to any one faith. You can be a theologian and not be a member of any faith at all. You can teach theology. But philosophers are even more wide-ranging, I suppose, and are well known for being completely crazy about almost everything. So giving a philosophical explanation is giving one with no holds barred intellectually. Right? So I will say what I believe, but I'll try and set out one or two philosophical positions that are widely held. The ones that sound completely peculiar are the ones probably held by me. Anyway, in the first lectures I talked about how I think that religion is based upon transcendent experiences, experiences of something that transcends sense experience, that goes beyond sense experience. And of course, believing in a public world of unobserved objects, especially a world such as quantum physicists talk about, is itself believing in something transcendent to sense experience. It's very different from sense experience. And the way it appears to us is very different from the way it actually is. So there's nothing very unusual about transcendent experiences. But I heard there's something special about experiences in art and morality. The word transcendence takes on a slightly different meaning of something that seems to communicate through sense experience, but has a meaning that is beyond it in various ways. So that sense of beyondness and of value, that's a very important component of art and morality. And then I held that experience of value is reasonably thought of as being based in some mind-like reality, because it is minds which think of future possibilities. Ordinary objects which are not mental, which have no mental properties, don't think of the future. An idea in the mind which is about something future, something that doesn't exist. So if a value is about a future desired possibility, which I think it is, then that's something which very naturally fits in with saying, well, some sense of objective mind in the universe is implied by thinking that there are values in art and morality that we encounter. It's, I suppose, a controversial philosophical opinion, but in the history of philosophy, most philosophers have held that there is an objective sense of value and that it is based in something mind-like, which in the West has been called God, though it doesn't have to be called God. And Buddhists who don't use the word God can often speak about pure mind as the basis of reality. Well, then I said, well, there's a philosophical basis for this in the philosophy of idealism, which was the reigning philosophy in Britain in the early 20th century, but then almost disappeared from the scene. It's slowly recovering now. There's me, and there are a few, there are a few other people, but it's not so widely held. I think the most fashionable philosophy at the moment is materialism, which is a very bold intellectual attempt to say that there is nothing but matter, ultimately. All there is in the end are superstrings or quarks or electrons or nuclear particles. And, of course, the big problem for such a view is consciousness, awareness. Nobody can say, even the most fervent materialist, that that problem has been solved, but materialists think it is solvable. So they spend their efforts trying to account for the existence of consciousness, whereas idealists who think that the basis of reality is mind itself don't have that problem. The idealist problem is, why is there any matter? Right. And of course the answer to that is, well, matter is what minds express themselves in. And in the human case, of course, matter actually gives rise to mind. So mind is a part of the material world, but it's a part which has non-material properties. So I think most idealists would be emergentists. They think, well, in some sense, in the human case, minds do emerge from very complex arrangements of matter, and there's no difficulty about that, but they're not purely or solely material. But the idealist usually believes, too, that as well as human minds, there is one cosmic mind, and perhaps God is much more than a mind. Perhaps God is beyond human comprehension, but God is at least mental. If you read in the Bible, for example, then God thinks, and God desires, and God wills, and these are things which minds do. So even if you don't think God is as simple, if it is simple, as a mind, you'd want to say that at least God is not less than a mind. So God is at least a mind-like being. So that was where I got to in those 3 lectures. Then last time I talked about personal knowing, knowledge of persons, and I held that in knowing yourself, in introspection, in meditation perhaps, and in knowing other people, especially in the experience of loving other people and getting to know things about them that other people don't know, and that depends upon them revealing themselves, disclosing themselves to you, this is a sort of knowledge which comes very near to religious knowledge, because you're using sensory experience to see something which is deeper and more important and is expressed through the senses, but whose reality is not just sensory. And after Martin Buber talked about the difference between I-thou relations, personal relations, when you think you're confronted with someone with intentions and desires and feelings and thoughts, and I-it relations, when you just think you're confronted with an object which you can dissect and analyze and use. So those are 2 different sorts of relationship. And I ended by saying, well, religious knowing, if there is such a thing, is going to be rather like personal knowing. It'll be seeing sensory experience as expressive of something deeper underlying it, and a reality which is more mind-like than not. So today I want to talk about religious knowing itself and the forms of religion there are. Because it may seem, philosophically, that all this is all right, that it's possible, it's perfectly rational to believe that the nature of reality is mind-like and that it's expressed through sensory experience. That makes very good sense, I think. But then you ask, well, if that's true, if the basis of reality is mind, isn't it reasonable to think that that mind would in some way, especially if it has some purpose for the world, some will, some way it wants the world to be, if the world is expressing, in fact, what it is, then that mind would, in some way, reveal or disclose itself to human beings. So then it's natural to move into religion. And religion is the area where it is said that spiritual reality reveals itself to certain human beings. So that seems a very natural thing to think. And I think if you were an idealist, you'd naturally look at religion to see whether this cosmic mind had revealed anything at all. But I have to say, most idealist philosophers in Britain, people like F.H. Bradley from Oxford, actually, in the 1920s, did not really, they were not religious. They did not belong to any religion. So an idealist isn't necessarily religious. I'm not going to spend any time asking what it is to be religious, but if somebody says they're not, I suppose they're not. It means they don't go to a church, they don't join that organization, and they don't believe all the things that they think religious people believe. Actually, that probably means they haven't met many religious people, but because religious people don't usually believe what they're supposed to believe, in my experience. I've been actually almost thrown out of churches by telling certain religious people what they're supposed to believe, particularly in Catholic churches, I have to say. I tell them what Thomas Aquinas actually said, and they say, that's heresy, that's terrible. And I say, that's what you're supposed to believe. Then I get thrown out. So what can we say about revelation and about whether the mind of the cosmos has disclosed itself in any sort of way that has been associated with religious organizations and institutions? Well, there's a difficulty straight away. And the big difficulty is there are so many religions in the world. I don't know that anybody has ever counted the number of religions there are, but it's in the thousands, certainly. I used to be head of the Department of New Religions in King's College, London. And new religions we classified as religions which came to Britain after 1945. That's how we classified it. And I don't know how many you think there are things classified for tax exemption for being religions. So you can tell which are religions. There were 370. So that's the number of classified tax-exempt religions there are. Why not start another one? We could do it this afternoon. Anyway, there you are. A lot of religions. Now, why is that a problem? Well, because they all disagree with each other. And most of them say they've had things revealed to them, even if they don't like God. Somebody comes along and says they've had some special knowledge, and perhaps some angel has told them something, or somebody's told them something. They know something you don't. But 370 of them since 1945, and thousands of them throughout the world, all having different revelations. It is a problem. So you have to say, well, does that mean the end of religion, really? I mean, you shouldn't believe any of that stuff. You should be agnostic about it. Well, I want to suggest that it's impossible to be agnostic. I think agnosticism is an impossible stance for anybody who thinks at all. And the reason is that, of course, people who really believe in God are people who pray to God and who think that God is an important factor in their lives. And that's the test of belief. It's what you do. I mean, you believe the ice is too thin to skate on if you don't skate on it. If you do skate on it, then you believe that it is thick enough to skate on. So your beliefs are shown by your practice. It's a very widely held belief, that, in modern philosophy. And if you believe that, then, of course, your religious beliefs are shown by your practice. And if you haven't any practice, then you have a belief, but it's not a religious belief, but it's a belief about religion, namely that it's not important. And if you think that religion is not important, then you're on the spectrum of possible beliefs about religion. Right? So you have to have some belief about religion, about whether one of these many religions is true or not. You can't say every belief about religion is false, because you must have one. So it's a very bad argument to say, well, since all beliefs about religion conflict, I'm not going to believe any of them. You are going to believe one of them, even if it's the one that says they're all false. Except, of course, what you believe, which is not religious, but still it's probably different from what the person next to you believes. Right? So we're all stuck with believing something. A complete agnostic is an impossibility. You cannot say, I believe nothing. That's just not possible. And you can't even say, I believe nothing about religion, because not practicing anything religious means you don't think it's important. And that's the most important thing there is to say about religious belief. Right. So you can't be agnostic. So we've all got the problem. I mean, what I'm suggesting here is it's not just a problem for religious people that there are lots of conflicting religious beliefs. It's a problem for everybody. I mean, why are there conservatives and socialists, and there's something else as well? But anyway, people do have different beliefs, and you may ask, why is it? It's a really puzzling question, because psychologists have spent a lot of time trying to identify particular psychological characteristics with particular political or religious beliefs, and they can't do it. There is no positive correlation between any personality type and your belief about religion or your belief about politics. So you can't say all those people are crazy. That's not true. And nor can you say all those people are the wisest and best of human beings, because that's not true either. We're a complete mixture. So you can't account for it just by looking at people's personalities. Right, well, I come back to this later, but let's just say at the moment, it can't be a reason for not believing anything about religion that there are lots of different religious beliefs. But we must be able to explain why it is that people have those beliefs and why they all differ. Well, I think we can do that, and it's actually not very difficult to do. And I'm going to mention three things that would influence the formation of people's belief. I mean, the first one is we're all brought up in different cultures. So I speak English, and obviously you speak English, and speaking English is giving you a certain set of concepts that you'll be familiar with and you use. Whether or not you believe in God, if I use the word God, you'll know roughly what I mean, but there are some cultures which wouldn't even know what that means. And many languages don't translate into others. So already learning a language gives you a certain perspective on the world, which is proper to your culture and may be very different from other people's cultures. And that's just a factor of being human. So different cultures do differ, and different cultures have different histories too. So the history of our culture, whatever it is, and many of us may come from a mixture of different cultures, but all of those histories are very different from each other. And a country which is rich and where there is a very good developed economy and where we can take for granted that actually health services are available and education is available, are very different from cultures which are small military defense leagues against encircling enemies. So if you think back to the origins of religions in human history, then you look at the Hebrews. That's one place where one set of religions originated. The Hebrews were a nomadic set of tribes who are constantly being attacked by surrounding nations. And so in that situation, it's not surprising that their ideas about what is ultimately valuable, what is ultimately worthwhile, would be rather militaristic. They'd be concerned with pride and heroism and courage, and they would see life as very hard and a life of competition and conflict in a militaristic sense. So you'd expect that in a culture like that, a nomadic, oppressed people, particularly if they'd been, as the Bible says, there were slaves in Egypt who had been liberated, you can see how their values would be very different from the values of a culture like ours, where, you know, Britons never, never shall be slaves, we say. I've even heard Americans singing that, strangely enough, not realizing what they were singing, I don't suppose. And we take a lot of things for granted, and we have an army, of course, but we have an army. We don't all have to be militaristic, and we probably don't all prize the virtues of courage and bloodthirstiness. Right? We'd rather say it would be better to have a peaceful society and to have a police force to look after things. So we argue about whether the police should be armed, for example. That's only possible in a society which is very secure and very developed, and which has lots of allies as well as many enemies. So you can see how the virtues of an ancient Greek in Athens or of an ancient Hebrew in Palestine and the values of somebody in a developed Western country now, those values would be very different because the history of the culture is different and the environment in which people live is very different. And that largely accounts for the differences in values that people have. And those differences in values give rise to differences in what you think the supreme value is. Now, if you're talking about a spiritual reality, you're talking about what you hold supremely valuable. And you're going to say, if there's a God, for example, that God will express and represent and incarnate in itself everything that is of supreme value. So if you've got these different values because of your different histories and cultures, then you're going to have different views. And I suppose if you look at the religious life of the world, it has three great originating points. One is the Middle East, around Iraq, Iran, and what is now Palestine. And in that part of the world, we can say that the Abrahamic faiths originated. That is, most faiths go back to Abraham as somebody who was very important at their beginning. They give slightly different accounts of Abraham, but still they have Abraham as a leader. And they all think of God as a sort of warlord. In the Bible, God is described as the God of hosts, the Lord of hosts. And the host means army, so the God of armies. We usually don't like to translate it that way in church, but that's what it is. And of course, the Ark of the Covenant, which was carried in front of the armies, was there as a sort of military symbol. And when it was lost, that was a great disaster because it was a way of assuring victory. So it was a society where victory was very important, where defense was of the first importance, and where their supreme value, God, the value that God incarnated, was a value that was to do with, well, two great things in Hebrew history. Liberation from slavery, So God was a liberator. This supreme value was one of liberation, and also law, because in the Middle East, in Sumeria and Babylon, law codes were set up to regulate how society was to run. And it became very important to speak about justice in the sense of command given by a king, which would be obeyed by the people. So God became seen as a king and a lawgiver. So a king, a lawgiver, a liberator, these were the values of that society in its environment projected onto their view of spirit. And that wasn't surprising, but that was one particular way of seeing spirit. There was a very different way in the other two main originating points of the historical religions, and those two are both based around river valleys. In fact, the Yellow River in China and the Ganges in India. So it's India and China that you look to see the other main originating points, which were very different. And I'm suggesting they were different largely because of the very different historical contexts. That is, the sort of experiences that the people had had over many generations, and then the sorts of interpretations which their intellectuals had given to those experiences. So let's look at the one from India in general, and in a very general way, you can say that they never thought of supreme value in their religious writings as a king, as a king who gave commands that people had to obey. So in the Abrahamic tradition, you think God is a commander. We must obey God. Obedience is whether we like it or not, is part of the Abrahamic view of God. You obey God. God commands. To do your duty is to obey God's commands. And maybe if you do, God will reward you, again, as a king who can do that. That didn't happen in India. And one reason for that was that the Indian way of thinking was not able to square the immense amount of suffering in the universe with the existence of a king who ran the whole thing. And they didn't think that actually personal life, individual personal life, was terribly important. That is to say, it wasn't the chief value to be a person, whereas as things have developed in the Jewish, Christian and Muslim tradition, in fact, the rights of the human personality as an individual have been important. That hasn't been part of the context in Indian thought. It's not that they didn't believe that humans weren't important. It was that actually in the context of the culture in which they lived, the community was perhaps more important than the individual. And the sense of the whole of which you were part was more important than the sense of the rights which you as an individual have against everybody else. So the idea of a king didn't appeal very much, really. And what appealed instead was the thought of escape from suffering. That this world, I'm taking a roughly Buddhist interpretation here, but it goes further back into the ascetic traditions of India, that what you need to do is to be liberated, still the word liberated, but not politically now, not liberated from an oppressive ruler, but to be liberated from the things which attach you to the world, which cause you suffering. You know the four great truths of Buddhism, including mainly that everything brings suffering upon you in the end. And so the aim of the religious life, of the spiritual life, is to escape from suffering. And what causes suffering is attachment to things, wanting to possess things and being attached to things. And so the religious way is to overcome attachment, to become non-attached. So it's a way of being not attached to the things of the world. Now, that's very different, it seems, from the Abrahamic view that actually the thing to do is do your duty in the world because obey the king who's ruling the world. It's a very different way of thinking, that the world is not a good place. The world is on the whole a bad place. But there are ways of overcoming that badness. The three fires of greed and hatred and ignorance. Right? Those are the three fires in Buddhism which you are to extinguish. And you extinguish it through, of course, meditation and right conduct and right thought. So that whole way of thinking has come from a different way of interpreting the experiences of a particular culture over many generations. And it grows up into a distinct tradition. So I'm suggesting it's not surprising that this happens, because people do have different experiences, cultures have different experiences, they have different histories, and they're interpreted in different ways. There's no given interpretation which everybody just accepts. You have to interpret it your own way. And then in China, something different happened as well. China was for much of its history an officially Buddhist country. Nevertheless, Chinese religion is much more associated perhaps with Confucianism, and the Confucian view is a much more world-affirming view, that what is important is having a harmonious and stable society. The notion of harmony, yin and yang, male and female, dark and light. Perhaps we wouldn't like those oppositions today, but there they are. Those oppositions must balance each other. So the primary notion is one of balance and harmony and integration. And the Chinese did this in different ways. Taoism is very different from Confucianism, almost an opposite way of achieving balance, but they're both attempts to achieve balance. Confucianism is concerned with balance in society among people, and therefore with ways of conduct, how to conduct yourself in society. Whereas Taoism is much more concerned with nature and achieving a harmony with nature, and not so concerned with social order. But they're both ways of looking at balance and harmony. So here's another approach to fundamental human values and needs and desires of saying, well, we do need to think about harmony and balance and the life in this world. That's the important thing. Not such a great concern. I was going to say not such a great concern with life after death, but then I remember that, of course, in early Hebrew religion, right up to the end of the Old Testament, there was virtually no concern with an afterlife at all. It just wasn't of concern. What was important was to leave a good name for your family, and that your family would have a good life. So it's a very late development in Hebrew religion that people came to think about something called resurrection. So it's not quite true that only in China was life after death not important. Nevertheless, the Chinese had a different view because they had not been an enslaved people, a small society without a country always being attacked by their enemies. It wasn't like that. It was a large set of countries. There were wars and there was violence, of course. But nevertheless, there was the thought that the way to go on, the way to solve these problems was to have a balanced and ordered society. And Confucius came later on to represent an ideal of this order and balance. So these are quite natural ways of interpreting very different sorts of human experiences. And therefore, if you're going to say that religion grows out of the growth of values in human lives, you're going to say it's not surprising that there are very different values that people have. I'm not, at this point, trying to reduce your values to your social context. I think that would be going too far. But I think it is obvious that what your values are does depend a lot on your social context. So, I mean, to go back to politics for a moment, it's quite obvious that it's going to be, on the whole, there's going to be a positive correlation between your wealth and your association with the Conservative Party. It's not true of everyone, of course. But as a general remark, I mean, that is roughly correct. And that if you're going to be a member of a trade union, the odds are you're probably going to be a socialist of some sort. So you say, well, it's to do with your job, with your role in society, with the sort of society there is. People's values will take shape in that way. Again, I'm not reducing values just to your social position. I'm saying there is a correlation here. It's not surprising that you get different results because people's experiences are different. Which, of course, already raises the thought that maybe one way, if we want to get values closer together, is to get people to have different sorts of experiences and to understand the experiences of people very different from them. And until you've experienced poverty, you really don't know what it's like. I suppose it's true that unless you've experienced extreme wealth, you don't know what it's like, but I don't know about that. So, there you are. But experience is terribly important. And as my whole philosophical outlook is based on knowledge starting with experience and then being interpreted, you'd expect that in religion there'd be lots of different views. So my expectation would be, of course, there's not going to be just one religious view. There are going to be a whole lot of diverse different views around, and that's not very surprising. But is there anything which holds them together at all? Well, yes. There is. They're all concerned with value. They're all concerned with the question, what is the supreme value? They're really all concerned, too, with how to overcome sheer personal egoism and greed. And you can say that at least the developed religions, the ones that we have in the world today with great traditions running back centuries, are concerned with overcoming a sense of ego and associating oneself with a higher value to which you can devote yourself. So there's the common core. If you want a common core of religiosity, it is that, the sense that you can overcome a sense of pure ego and associate yourself with a value that is higher than you and that will fulfill your life. It's just that there are different ways of doing that. And those different ways are not all equally morally acceptable. Some of them would appeal to us as more morally acceptable and others as less. Let me just give you 3 simple examples of that to show what I mean. Or perhaps 2 would do. One would be, let's look at one we would all think was very bad, and that is Jihadist Islam. I could have taken this from the Crusades in Christianity, or I could have taken it from episodes in the history of Judaism too, but the one we're all familiar with now is Jihadist Islam. I mean, the sort of view which says you must take statements in the Quran literally, in the most literal possible sense, and you must impose them upon the rest of the population by force. Now, this fits the definition of religion, all right. It is overcoming a sense of pure ego. It's not a selfish sort of religion at all. And it is obedience to what is felt to be a higher value, and that higher value is justice, certainly a very great concern for justice, and for human brotherhood, because all people should be members of one faith, Islam, the house of Islam. So it fits quite well into that, but we would feel, everyone in this room would feel, something has gone badly wrong. It went wrong with Plato too, let me remind you, that Plato, of course, is rightly thought of as the first of the great philosophers who perhaps was associated with democracy and liberal thought and philosophical thought, but Plato said in his book, The Laws, his latest book, which not many people read, thank goodness, but in that book, The Laws, he actually turned out to be a virtual fascist. He said that his perfect society ought to be imposed by force on everybody else. He even said that people who didn't worship the 12 gods of the pantheon in Greece should be executed, and that people shouldn't be allowed to leave the country in case they got perverted by the views of foreigners. Right, now that's Plato. That's why Sir Karl Popper thought that Plato was one of the enemies of the open society. But that's a very controversial view, of course, because Plato was one of the originators of the open society as well. So he was a very ambiguous person. But so are we all. And I suppose that's the thing. All religions, all beliefs can go badly wrong. There's not a good or not an infallible defense against that. And that teaches us another lesson. I mean, the first lesson I would take from that very brief look at the origin of religions is that we should expect diversity and therefore not condemn diversity. I think it would show ignorance of human nature to say that everybody should believe the same thing. We shouldn't expect that. But it doesn't follow you shouldn't believe what you do believe, right? So we'll have to come to how you sort out your own beliefs in a moment. But diversity is good, that's the first thing. But the second thing is it can all go wrong. So we should never think there is a system such that it's bound to be right and nothing can go wrong with it. And therefore it's the best system there is. There's no best system. Everything can go wrong. And it has gone wrong. I think if you look at the history of all religions, you can see places where it has caused violence and harm and destruction. But those haven't, of course, ever been the major features of religious life, and every social survey that's ever been done, and many of them, of course, in recent years have been done, has shown that in general, religious belief promotes greater charitable giving, greater friendliness, less reliance on drugs and alcohol, etc. So there are huge numbers of positive attributes of religious life, but they can still go wrong. So that teaches us that we should never be content with whatever it is that we don't believe. I mean, whether we're religious or not, probably what we believe is partly wrong. And it might be harmful, and we need to be very careful about that. And I would apply this to myself as well as to anybody else. What is harmful, we can't see. We have to ask somebody else, is this harming you? So that means you've got to be open and listening to what other people say. So there are some lessons out of this, but what about our own beliefs? Well, here I want to appeal to Thomas Nagel, philosopher Thomas Nagel, who wrote a book and originated the very useful expression, I think, there is no such thing as a view from nowhere. What goes wrong in thinking about human beliefs and about religion often is that we think we stand outside this mess of human life where anything can go wrong and where people have all sorts of diverse beliefs, and often there's not much to choose between them as far as you can tell. But we think, no, we are the impartial spectators and we can decide between them. So we think, oh, let's put all religions in a big list and choose which one is the best. So you choose the best religion. Or if it's atheism, you choose that. But you make the choice. You're totally impartial. So anybody who disagrees with you is not rational. I know one or two people like that, and they're all crazy. Well, I suppose I shouldn't say that, should I? They all disagree with me. So nobody, Thomas Nagel points out, quite rightly, is in that position. Nobody is impartial. I have to stand here and say, look, what I'm saying, I believe, but I am pretty old, pretty English, pretty, what else? Educated, right? And I'm male, right? So there are things about me that I'm stuck with. And I've got to say, that's the position I speak from. There's no use pretending I don't have these attributes. So that's where I am. I'm at a particular position. I have a particular social role in a particular culture with a particular history. And that has helped to define who I am. And that's where my perspective is from. So everybody speaks from a perspective. That means none of us is an impartial spectator of religious beliefs or of the religious world. We already have a view. You were undoubtedly taught a view when you were children. Whatever it was, you were taught one. You probably can't remember it, but that view is affecting your life now. There is no doubt. That's where you started from. So the position we are all of us in is that it's not that we're impartial. We have a view. We actually have a view. Now, we can't say we thought of that view. No, we were taught that view. That's what we were taught, and we believed it. The question is, how have we moved on? And what is the best way to move on? So I think one would say straight away, well, there's no chance that we have the one true view out of everybody else in the world, and that's what we happen to be taught. That would be called exceptionalism, right? Making an exception of yourself. Everybody else is prejudiced by their upbringing, etc., but I'm not. No, you can't say that. So you've got to say, no, I'm prejudiced by my upbringing. So the first rule is to face up to your prejudice, find out what it is. Are there things in the place I speak from which makes me unable to appreciate certain values? And the second thing is, well, the best way to deal with this position, you can't ever be unprejudiced, but you can extend your prejudices. That is, you can widen your experience and your contact with people of other views than yours and try to take account of what they're saying. You don't have to believe what they're saying. You can't help what you believe. Right? It's not under your control. You do not choose your beliefs. Right? It's not a matter of choice. What you believe is what you come to say, I can't help thinking this. But what you can do is look at the arguments and the evidence that exist and make your knowledge as wide as it can be, and then your beliefs will change, no doubt, accordingly. So you can look at the things that might change your beliefs. So if you thought that poverty wasn't so bad, really, maybe living in poverty for a couple of years might change your beliefs. But you wouldn't be choosing that. You'd be choosing to live in poverty. You'd be choosing to do something which might affect your beliefs, but you don't choose the beliefs themselves. So I suppose on this view, you'd really ideally have to try a religion to see what it was like before you could really know whether you believed it or not. You've got to be part of it before you can make a decision about it. And even then, it's not a decision. It is what happens to you when you are part of it. So what you can choose is to be part of certain groups, but you can't choose what happens as a result of that. So, and the lesson in our world, I think, is that for the first time in history, really the first time in history, you can actually be part of a global community. When I was younger, I specialized in the study of Indian religion of a certain sort. You can only specialize in one tiny part of Indian religion, and I did that. But to do that, I had to go to India and spend a lot of money and a lot of time getting there and have diarrhea for a couple of years while I was there, etc., etc. It was quite difficult. Okay. Now, I press a button on Google, and it all comes up. Everything's there. And up comes all this stuff in translation, of course, but I can then check on the translation. Right? You can check whether the translations are good or not. So there's a lot of misleading stuff there, but in principle, we now have access to information from the whole world. So that is, I think, what you'd have to say about the study of religion. You'd have to say it is a good thing to extend your knowledge, and by extending your knowledge of religion, I mean your experience of it, experience of what it's like for people who have that sort of religious belief. And that's all you can do, and then let your beliefs form. But diversity will still exist, so you shouldn't expect that everybody who goes in for this process will come to believe the same thing. It's just that it's a good thing to recognize what your prejudice is, to put it in a global context so you see how it fits into a world in which people live in very different ways, and then extending your experience and your knowledge as much as you can and seeing what happens. So my answer to the question, what should you do about your religious beliefs in a world of so many different beliefs, is, well, start from where you are, get to know what you were brought up with better. If you react against it, well, all right, learn as much as you can, experience as much as you can, of a range of different views. And the mistake most people make is that when they look at religion, for example, when they look at Christianity, they just take one form of Christianity and criticize that. But there are thousands of forms of Christian belief, and maybe to look at experience different forms of Christian belief would then be something that was a worthwhile experience. Well, I've talked about diversity and I've talked about commonality. What I want to do now is just, since this lecture is called Forms of Religious Thought, give you the suggestion that there are actually 6, and only 6, possible forms of religious thought, taken in a very general sense. And these forms are defined by being ways of relating spiritual reality with material reality. There are only 6 possible relationships. You can get at me afterwards about this. There are only 6 possible forms of relationship between spiritual reality and material reality, and here they are. And each one of them gives rise to a different sort of religious view, and you're going to be somewhere on this list, right? You're going to be one of the 6. First one is materialism. And materialism is the view there's nothing but a material reality. There's no spiritual reality at all. Right, well, lots of people believe that. Some religions believe that, incredibly enough. Mormons believe that, for example. And there are some Indian denominations which believe that, but it's pretty rare, so it's not very common. There is no spiritual. So that's materialism. Well, go to the opposite end of the spectrum and you get there is no material reality. That's idealism, okay? In its extreme form. There is nothing but spirit. And I suppose if you want a person who believes that, it's the Indian philosopher, 8th century Shankara. And Shankara is the founder, really, of Advaita Vedanta, that is non-dualistic Vedantic thought in India. So millions of people are adherents of that school. So all is spirit. Everything is spirit. The word that will be used in the Indian context is Brahman, B-R-A-H-M-A-N, which we usually translate as absolute reality. And everything is part of Brahman. That is the one spiritual reality, being, consciousness, and bliss. And everything else is an illusion arising out of that. And the spiritual way is to overcome that illusion and realize that all is one spirit, including you and everything else as well. So that's the other extreme. There is no real matter. Then, obviously, in the middle is dualism. And dualism says there is both spirit and matter, but they're very different. And I suppose dualistic forms of thought would tend to be some forms of Buddhism, and Jainism is a major part of that sort of belief, which is the material reality is real, but it is to be escaped. And so the spiritual life is a path from the material to the spiritual. So it is a way of renouncing the material, right? Getting rid of karma, as you might say. Right? You renounce the material world and you become pure spirit. Right? So, but it's dualistic. Both matter and spirit exist, but they are different. And probably the way of liberation is to renounce attachment to the material. Some forms of Buddhism, particularly Theravada, ancient traditional Buddhism, hold a view rather like that. How many is that? I've got three. Oh, I've got three more to go. What other relations could there possibly be? Well, one of them is that monism. Monism, M-O-N-I-S-M. Monism is the view there is only one reality, and it is both spiritual and material. I'm just looking at every possible relation there could be. So this says there's only one reality. I'm a monist, actually, but I'm an idealistic monist. Right? So, as a monist, there is only one reality, but actually you think one bit's more important. One aspect of this reality is more important than the other. So I think the spiritual or mental aspect is more important than the material or physical aspect. But they're both aspects of the one reality. I think most Chinese religions are monistic in this sense, as is Mahayana Buddhism. That's the other main school of Buddhism. You say there is only one reality. One great Buddhist sage put it like this: samsara, the world of suffering, is the same as nirvana, the world of liberation from suffering. It's the same world. It all depends on how you see it. So there's one world, but it can be seen with different aspects. Right? So that's quite a popular philosophical view. So that's monism. Two more to go. There is creation. I would say creationism, but I can't because that means something else. But creation. And creation is the view that there is spirit and there is matter, but matter is dependent upon spirit and originates from spirit. That's the traditional Christian doctrine. There is a spiritual God. God creates matter. Matter depends upon God. But they're both real. So that's a possible view, clearly. The Abrahamic traditions all fit into that. And the last one is Emergentism. And Emergentism is the view that the spiritual depends upon the material. There is a spiritual world, but it couldn't exist without the material world, and it comes from and depends upon the material world. Again, not many religions fit in there, but good old Mormonism does again. It's a very useful religion in some ways. Right. So you could hold that. Some Christians hold that. Some Christians I know hold that. And at least one Jewish rabbi I know holds that. But it's a rather difficult belief to hold, really, because you're going to say, well, without the material universe, there wouldn't be a spiritual universe at all. The spiritual is a sort of property, an emergent property of the material, but it depends on the material. So there are the 6 possible views. There's 6 possible views of the relation of mind and body, but there are also 6 possible views of the relation of spirit to matter, God to the world. right? It's pure mind or whatever it is to this world. Since these are the 6 possible logical views, and since human beings are such inventive and imaginative beings, you'd expect that some human beings would fall into every category, and they do. So again, diversity just springs from the logical possibilities that human beings are going to explore. It's good to explore them, but most of them are wrong. That is to say, if you believe one of them, you can't believe the others. These are exclusive. But how do you decide? As I say, you don't decide. You're already in one of them. You already are predisposed to think that one of them is more sensible than the others. That's where you are. So you go from there. So here's my prejudice. I believe that matter and spirit are both real. I believe the material universe has a positive role. It's not just an illusion. It has a positive part to play in the expression of spiritual reality. I believe that individual souls are free and unique and independent. So I'm not a monist, really. I believe that there are many, many individual souls different from the one cosmic mind. And I believe that human souls can be united to the spiritual reality. They can become parts of the divine. And in that, I think that means I could fit either into the Indian school of Ramanuja, which is called Vishishta Advaita Vedanta, but you needn't worry about that. But anyway, I like that. Or I could be a Methodist. But it's easier to be a Methodist, probably. I'm actually an Anglican, but that's because I like singing. So there you are. So what I'm saying is you look at the forms of religion, and it may seem perplexing that revelation has come in so many different ways, but the mystery is dispelled when you see that human beings are just so different. You expect them to be different. You look at all the logical possibilities there are, and the final clue is this, that you say when people have revelations, there is an objective element. There is something that they encounter. They have knowledge by acquaintance with a spiritual reality. But that knowledge by acquaintance is not the same and does not entail knowledge by description. That is to say, you know me by acquaintance, here I am. You could describe some things about me, but not a lot. There are a lot of things about me you don't know. So, there are a lot of things you might have different views about me as well. So knowledge by acquaintance is compatible with lots of different knowledges by description, right? Depending on when you saw me, what you heard me say, how you interpreted it, etc. So it's the same in religion. It's the same in revelation. Something is encountered, and it's like personal knowledge. It's like encountering a person, but the description doesn't come written with the encounter. So this suggests that religious revelation is in fact not propositional, not something written down which you just get and there it is. It's rather an encounter with a personal kind of reality which you then, or your tradition, people in your culture, have interpreted over many generations in different ways. And I would call this a synergistic view of revelation. The synergy is between the objective givenness and the subjective interpretation. So I think what the study of religions teaches really is that revelation is a synergistic concept. There's an objective encounter, but there's a subjective interpretation, and they both go together. If you believe this, it would be possible to work for a convergence of spiritual views as not actually absolutely contradictory, but as different interpretations of different experiences of the same fundamental reality. I think the person who has best expressed this in recent work is John Hick. I don't agree with John Hick about everything. I think he's rather too agnostic about God in the end, for my liking. But that's because, well, we professionally have to disagree. So, again, divergence exists. But I think the view is, perhaps I'll end with using an image from Indian thought, and that is something in the Indian tradition called Indras net, or Indras Web. And that is a web with many jewels, millions of jewels, And the thought is that each jewel only shines with its own proper light when it reflects every other jewel in it, from its own perspective. And the lesson is you don't give up your perspective, but you reflect from where you are the perspectives of everything in the world that you know about. I think it's a nice image to end a series on religion and experience. Thank you.